Okay, just get started here now. We can finish up at before 10 to 4, so we're under a small bit of time pressure here. The format of today, anyway, I'll just speak for a couple of minutes just to get things kicked off, then we'll hand over to Erik to give the main talk, and then afterwards we'll have a question and answer session. So we've brought along plenty of good questions for him today, and then we'll just wrap up at the end just before 10 to 4. Now, I presume most of you probably have been to LookLeft forums before, but if you haven't, and actually this is my first time at one of Dublin myself, it's a space opened up by the LookLeft magazine, which presumably you've all bought a copy of now from straight off the presses. It's a space for political education in a very, very broad sense, not party specific, but political education of the left and debate and discussion, very much like the magazine itself is. The speaker today is Erik Olin Wright. You've obviously read a little bit, or you wouldn't be here to see him speaking. So professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, so that in itself, I'm sure he has some good stories to tell about that and what's happened over there in the last year or so. Currently president of the American Sociological Association, but more importantly, author of a number of books, the most recent one of which is Envisioning Real Utopias, 2010 published. And the talk today that Erik will be giving is in part based on some of the content of that book. He'll go into that in a bit more detail. I read the book now when it came out in the summer of 2010. I just joined the Workers' Party at that stage. I have to say I found the book quite inspirational in terms of moving beyond the sort of accepted dogma that's laden down the left for quite a long time. A lot of the theory and rhetoric of the left, it provides a firm foundation, but I think a lot of people have difficulty moving on with it, keeping it current. And personally, I found the book broke through that particular barrier. It addressed questions of how do we build socialism, treat socialism as a process rather than a thing. I suppose we all do, but it looks at different strands within socialism, which I believe Erik will be speaking about today. But roughly, you can categorise it as social democratic, revolutionary, and anarchist, or at least that's what I took from it anyway. The book doesn't focus on the differences between those, but it treats them very much as intertwining emphasis that can build each other up rather than focusing on the difference between them and focusing on the negativities. I think that dynamic that the book, I presume the talk will speak about, is something that within the left as a movement we need to be a little bit more open to that. Not just working together on single issue campaigns, but maybe just having an overarching understanding of how we can get to socialism in a society and how the different strands will have a different emphasis. And there's no, that's perfectly fine, of course, but we don't need to be stepping on each other's toes and doing things against each other. We can actually cooperate to move society leftwards. The book speaks really in terms of a roadmap of steps from where we are now to where we'd like to be. Maybe there are different places we'd like to be, but the process of moving along through the steps, through the experiments, will reinforce our understanding of what's achievable and also what's desirable. I think that's the strength of the book and the process that Erik has described. So that roadmap of steps, it'll be fleshed out as we move along. It'll be seen to be viable, and by doing that, we'll win popular support. We have a full room here today, but it's not like the population out there at large is bursting through the door to come in here to speak to us or to Erik. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and this book provides a way forward. And with that, I'll hand over to Phil himself.
So it's a kind of ritual thing to say at the beginning of talks, I'm delighted to be here. But sometimes ritual things actually are meant from the heart. I am delighted to be here. I especially like having the opportunity to talk at political forums, a political forum like this, where people are seriously engaged and worrying about what to do and where we're going, rather than just purely academic contexts where I'm trying to lay out theoretical arguments because of their relevance to various sociological and other questions. So this is exciting for me. I hope you'll find it exciting as well. Now what I'd like to do, I think, is not give a full-bore, comprehensive lecture on my whole framework for this kind of approach, to focus in on a few elements, and then I may elaborate at more length in response to the dialogue. I'd like to get to the conversational part of this relatively quickly. Let me first give a very brief prologue to situate the specific things I'm going to talk about. Then I'll lay out what I will describe as three broad strategic logics that have characterized the left, the anti-capitalist left over the last 200 years, 150 years or so. And then make an argument about how I think these three logics should, how we can think about their being connected to each other in the present era. So first, a little prologue. A fully developed social emancipatory theory and an accompanying politics, I think, has to come to grips with four theoretical tasks, intellectual tasks. The first is clarifying the moral foundations on which we're building our struggles for a better world. In the Marxist tradition, those have often been left implicit. Marx himself was somewhat suspicious about moral and normative discussions, but his work, as we all know, is just filled with moral judgment. And I think it's important to make those explicit. Partially because in making them explicit, a lot of people discover they're pretty obvious. You know, they do correspond to moral common sense. And that adds weight, I think, to our ability to talk to people about these ideas. So the first is moral foundations. The second is the diagnosis and critique of the world as it is, on the basis of those moral foundations. Critique is always from the point of view of some standard. You're criticizing existing structures because of the way they create suffering, the way they deprive people of the capacity to live well, injustice. There's all sorts of ways we can talk about it. The diagnosis and critique of existing institutions is the second task. The third task is the elaboration of a theory of alternatives. Alternatives that respond to the diagnosis and critique and would better realize the moral foundations. And finally, we need a theory of transformation. How to get from here to there. That particular sequence is the way I like to lay this out. I'd like to frame the problem of how do we think about alternatives as a precondition for our theory of transformation. Now that might seem a little backward to some people. They might think that the theory of how do we change the world as it is needs to come after the critique of the world as it is. But I think as from the political point of view, and particularly from the point of view of thinking through strategy, we need to know where we want to go in order to properly understand what the logic of transformation is. So those are the four steps. I'm going to focus mainly on the fourth here. I was asked to speak on this broad question of the logics of strategy or strategic logics. But all four are really important. The book, Envisioning Real Utopias, actually focuses more on the third. It's more about the problem of what do we want? What is the meaning of socialism that can animate a destination to which we want to orient our struggles, particularly in the context of the 21st century, after the experiences of both what happened in the world and the use of that term in the world in the 20th century. Some of what I'll say about logics, strategic logics, will also bear on that third theme. How should we think about alternatives? But I'm going to focus on the fourth here. Now I'm assuming, because of the nature of the gathering, that we broadly share the moral foundations around values of equality, solidarity, community, sustainability, democracy. I tend to focus especially on equality and democracy, but there's multiple values that intersect. I assume we also broadly share the diagnosis and critique of existing institutions. That is, that capitalism as a way of organizing economic relations.
I'm not really here. No.
Pardon? What? That capitalism as a way of organizing economic structures and processes systematically generates harms that violate these moral standards. It creates eliminable forms of human suffering and deficits in human flourishing and deficits in democracy. And that's intrinsic to capitalism, even if it's the case that capitalism comes in many flavors and some are worse than others with respect to these issues. Okay, so now on the logics of transformation. I'll decide sort of spontaneously whether I want to draw pictures. See, maybe that'll come more in the discussion. So, as a professional sociologist, one of the elements of our craft is to develop jargon, right? We like to brand our concepts, and so I have labels for these three strategic logics. I'll give you the labels and then I'll explain what's going on within each of them. So the first strategic logic is ruptural. I use the term ruptural rather than revolutionary, although it's associated with the revolutionary tradition, because it can be thought of as a particular way in which you think a revolution would come to pass and what it would do. So I think all three of these logics can be thought of as revolutionary. They want a foundational transformation of existing institutions. And that's what it means, in one sense at least, to be revolutionary. To really want a fundamental transformation of the way the world is. The word ruptural describes the strategy through which that would be accomplished. So the first is ruptural, the second is interstitial, and the third is symbiotic. The ruptural tradition is associated with revolutionary socialism or communism. Interstitial is associated with certain strands of anarchism. And symbiotic strategies is associated with left-wing social democracy. I mean, we have to unfortunately add the adjective, the prefix left-wing to social democracy, since the term has drifted so far to the right in recent decades. I mean, I'll just say social democracy for short, but I mean social democracy that's still embodies an anti-capitalist component to it. That's associated then with what I'm calling symbiotic strategies. Okay, let me say a little bit about the logic of each of these. So ruptural logics of transformation argue that what's needed is to create the conditions or to seize the time when those conditions occur. So, it may be that you can't actually create the conditions for rupture, but you can seize the time when those conditions occur. The ruptural logic says when those conditions occur, you have to seize power in such a way that you're able to smash the central systems of power in the society, that you can break the power of dominant classes, the capitalist class in the case of capitalism, to such an extent that you undo their capacity to reproduce their social relations. And that occurs as a rupture. It's not a slow process of incremental erosion of their power. It's not a co-optation of capital to some other project, whatever that would mean. It's a smashing of their class power. And because it has this very sharp discontinuity, it's generally thought of as requiring control over state power. That is, the capacity to repress that class and to prevent its ability to sustain a reproduction of the existing social order. So the kind of, one way of thinking about it is smash first, build second. Seize state power, transform the state apparatuses so that you can use it to smash the existing institutional matrix of power and inequality, and then you build an alternative. I mean, that's a way simplified portrait, but it captures, I think, the essential logic of a ruptural break. There's a kind of before and after. And that's ruptural strategies. Interstitial strategies have a very different vision of how transformation could occur. The basic idea is to get on with the business of building alternatives in the world as it is, in whatever spaces and cracks and niches this is possible. To struggle to expand those spaces when you encounter obstacles, but to fill those spaces with new ways of living and producing and being. This was Proudhon's vision in the famous debate with Marx in the 1840s. Some Marxologists probably can give me the dates better than I can. You know, in those days, long ago. So Proudhon had the following, it's a super attractive idea. I mean, whether or not you think it's plausible is another question, but it's a really nice vision. So the idea was this: why not have workers own their own firms and just compete the hell out of capitalism? So we got worker-owned firms. They would join together collaboratively. They wouldn't need bosses. They'd be way more efficient because they'd be working for themselves. They wouldn't be wasting resources on the monitoring and surveillance necessary to extract effort because they would be collaboratively monitoring each other and working together. So you form worker-owned firms. And you create institutions, the create institutions being by workers themselves, to facilitate the growth of such firms. And capitalist firms are simply going to find it impossible to recruit a labor force, because workers will always opt for working in co-ops. And by the rules of the game established under bourgeois property rights, worker-owned collaborative firms will simply displace capitalism. I mean, that's the kind of rosy image, but you can see the strategic logic is what I want to emphasize here. For the moment, suspend whatever skepticism about whether this is remotely feasible. The idea is, let's just get on with the business of building the alternative society in the womb of the old, and it'll grow, and it'll crowd out the competitors. Marx was initially super skeptical of this, in fact derisive of it. Later, he was actually much more sympathetic, skeptical of its capacity to accomplish its ultimate goals, but very supportive of the kind of exemplary illustrative modeling that it would show to people, and also feeling that the main obstacle was simply it would not be permitted. Now that's an interesting, he has a speech that's reproduced in various anthologies where this debate is discussed. I think it was, might have been the inaugural of the, I should never walk onto this terrain of quoting Marx because I'm really bad at it. It's this is a little side point. I've always resisted that as a temptation in the intellectual tradition of which I'm an enthusiastic part, because quoting Marx encourages an intellectual practice which I think is a really bad practice, which is to defend one's arguments by reference to sacred texts. And it creates a very bad intellectual practice. Evolutionary biologists do not quote Darwin in making arguments about the difficult issues in evolutionary biology. So I shouldn't venture onto this terrain, which I'm not good at anyway, because I have resisted being a full participant in it. In any case, what Marx did say about the problem with worker co-ops is not that they couldn't thrive under capitalism by virtue of any technological or economic obstacle, but that simply they would be blocked by the power of the state. He felt that capitalists would not put up with competitive firms that were by workers, and they just would see to it, the lords of industry would just simply block it. So that was a political judgment about the possibility of that interstitial strategy, not an economic judgment. And that's, I think, an interesting point, because he was talking about, he was making that political judgment in the 1860s. Well, we're in a very different kind of political situation. It could be worse, who knows, but it's a different political situation. And it's a political judgment then about the barriers to an interstitial strategy more than it is, no, worker firms could never possibly compete with capitalist firms. Okay, that's interstitial strategies. Build now where you can, and then struggle to expand the spaces. Now, symbiotic strategies have a different kind of logic. Symbiotic strategies say, let's use whatever tools we have to expand the possibilities of popular power, including the bourgeois democratic state. If ruptural strategies are smash the state and interstitial strategies are ignore the state, symbiotic strategies are use the state. And the premise is that there are problems within capitalist economies, problems of instability, problems of disruption, problems of disequilibrium, all sorts of problems in capitalist economies, some of which can be solved and improved in ways that also expand the possibilities of future enhancements of popular power. It's what I like to call, there's a possibility for positive class compromises. I think this I will illustrate. I'll draw a picture for this. So the basic idea is this. On this axis, we put the interests of capital. So that goes from high to low. How well are the interests of capital realized? And on this axis, we put popular power. You can put various other terms. You could say the power of the working class if you want to define this in more restrictive class terms, or you could say popular power if you want to mean it in a somewhat looser expression. But what's the relationship between the power of the people, popular power, and the interests of capital? One view of that relationship is that it's simply a negative relationship. Right? The more power workers have, the more power people have, the worse it is for capital. That's a view held by certain strands of Marxist theory and by Milton Friedman. Right? So both the neoliberals and some Marxists believe that there's an inverse relationship between popular power and the interests of capital. The idea of a symbiotic strategy of social transformation occurs because of a view that there is also, that with enough popular power, there's actually an upturn in this curve. If popular power increases even more, it goes down. So the way you can think about it is this. This is low popular power. This is high, and this is dominant. So if the working class or if popular forces are the dominant power in a society, that's bad for capital. But this intermediate level is actually the worst situation. It's the worst situation because it's always easier to disrupt than it is to build. And the capacity of workers to disrupt capital increases, but their capacity to help capital solve problems increases only when their power goes beyond this. This region of the curve is the region for what I would call a positive class compromise. This part of the curve is the region for a negative class compromise. A negative class compromise is a balance of forces in which the only thing you can offer your opponent is a willingness to stop damaging them. So the strike is the classic example. What do workers offer capitalists when they're on strike? We'll stop striking. We'll stop hurting you if you agree to us. That's a balance of force issue. If workers have more power than just to impose damage, they can actually collaborate with capital to produce stable agreements in ways that help capitalism solve some of its own problems. This was what social democracy did in its golden age. in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s in Sweden and other places, there was a possibility of stable agreements between labor and capital in ways that were beneficial to workers and helped stabilize capitalism, not in the optimal way that capitalists would want. They'd prefer to be here than to be here, but they prefer to be here than to be here. And the working class was strong enough to prevent the move all the way back to here. So this region of the curve creates the region for collaboration and collective problem solving in which the state can be used in ways to create institutional spaces and, in which greater worker power is possible. Various forms of worker representation and co-determination schemes, works councils, and other more democratic arrangements whereby compromises and collaboration is organized are characteristic of this part of the curve. And that's the underlying theoretical basis for what I'm calling symbiotic strategies, again associated with social democracy. Now, historically, on the left, these three strategic logics, ruptural, interstitial, and symbiotic, are often treated as mutually exclusive. And in particular, there's hostility between people who support ruptural strategies, political movements who put their bets that nothing can be done of any worth within capitalism. The only option is to smash its institutions, which requires a seizure of power and a ruptural break. Ruptural strategies have been treated as mutually exclusive with interstitial and symbiotic strategies. But also between the symbiotic and interstitial strategies, anarchists and social democrats haven't gone along very well either, although there's probably more space for some mutual ignoring of each other, since at least some anarchist traditions don't bother with challenging at the political level directly with social democracy. What I want to offer then is the view that these three different strategic logics should be seen as a kind of menu. I've simplified them here. They actually, in the elaboration in the book, there are more components to each of these, but this is giving just the overarching perspective. Think of it as a menu, and then ask under what historical conditions and in what ways should the different aspects of these strategic logics be combined? And how should we think about the articulation of different strategic elements? Now, I think in the 21st century, in the developed capitalist world, the key action lies in the interplay between interstitial and symbiotic strategies. And there are some aspects of ruptural strategies that can be relevant, but that by and large, the idea of a systemic rupture is not historically possible. It's just not possible. It's a fantasy. If it is the case that the only way to make life better under capitalism is a ruptural strategy, I think that means there's no way to make life better under capitalism. That is, it's not evidence in favor of a ruptural strategy that nothing else will work, because the ruptural strategy might not work as well. I have two main problems with the idea of a ruptural strategy under these historical conditions. So this isn't making a transhistorical argument that in all times and places ruptural strategies are implausible. Why I think they're implausible under these historical conditions: I don't think it will ever be possible to constitute a majority coalition in favor of a system rupture that is a rapid smashing of the existing institutional structures of power and the building of an alternative. I don't think a majority coalition is possible, and therefore the only way it could ever happen is if a minority did it, which means it would not be done under democratic conditions. And if it were done in that way, it would not result in a democratic and egalitarian outcome. So the only way to get a rupture is to do so undemocratically, and under the conditions under which that occur, it would not produce the outcome that socialists who share the moral foundations that I haven't elaborated here, but I assume we broadly share, want to see realized in an alternative. So if you want an alternative which is emancipatory, which creates conditions for human flourishing under egalitarian and democratic institutions, you can't get there by a rupture. If the only way you can get a rupture is through non-democratic means. And that's the core of my skepticism about ruptural strategies, taken as the dominant strategy that would guide any kind of left project of social transformation. So what about interstitial and symbiotic? How do I envision a possible way in which this provides for a real transformative possibility? Okay, let me give some illustrations first. This has been pretty abstract. I haven't given any real examples of what I'm talking about. And then make some comments about time horizons, about the time scale. Actually, let me make the time scale point first. We're all confronted with this kind of foundational fact of our existence, that our adult lives where we think about these things, the adult part of our existence, is roughly a half a century. You know, from sometime in your late teens to early 20s until sometime in your 70s or 80s. That's, for most people, the block of time in which we ourselves can be actors in history. And the question is that a time horizon that bears any relationship to the transformative projects which we're committed to? Now, if you feel like it's only worth committing yourself to a transformative project which can be realized in the course of the time horizon of an adult political lifespan, then you become very restrictive in your views about what kinds of strategies are possible. One of the attractions of ruptural strategies is, if they would work, they'd be quick. Right? I mean, that's the whole point. Smash, build. I think the transformation from capitalism to some post-capitalist emancipatory alternative has a time horizon more like the transformation of feudalism into capitalism. I mean, capitalism built up interstitially inside of feudalism. It also built up symbiotically. Feudal elites used capitalism for various purposes that helped them solve certain kinds of problems, which created greater space for capitalism to develop inside of feudalism. But that was a long process. It was also, of course, not a strategy. I mean, the actors involved were not saying, how can we overthrow capitalism? How can we transform it, feudalism into something else? They were simply engaging in adaptive strategies to cope with the conditions locally that they faced. But in so doing, they built up interstitially new institutions that lived alongside of feudal institutions. The two connected symbiotically. Capitalism helped solve problems in feudalism, but it did so in ways that expanded the space for capitalism. Now that's more like I think we should think about the transformation of capitalism. Build up new institutions that solve problems in capitalism, build them up from below, fill the spaces, and then struggle to expand the spaces. So let me give a couple of examples to give more weight to this. So let's go back to the classic interstitial alternative to capitalism, worker co-ops.